The wine glass slipped. For a single moment, the world seemed to stop. The deep red liquid splashed onto the pristine white floor, spreading like blood. And then a loud smack echoed through the hall. Zayan's hand was still in the air, his face twisted with rage. The woman he had just struck stumbled backward, her trembling hands clutching her burning cheek. Silence. The guests froze, their laughter dying in their throats. The music kept playing, but it felt wrong, out of place. She was just a maid, just an unfortunate worker who had made a mistake. But to Zayan, this was unforgivable. He took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. Sana, the maid, flinched. Her breath was uneven, her wide eyes filled with shock and fear. Zayan didn't care. "I told you." His voice was dangerously soft, but each word dripped with venom. "Do you have any idea how much this rug costs?" Sana didn't respond. She couldn't. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Another step. Another sharp intake of breath from the crowd. No one dared to move. No one dared to intervene. Because this wasn't just any man. This was Zayan Al-Fayed, a millionaire whose money and power could crush anyone who stood against him. And now, in front of all these people, he was about to strike again. Sana squeezed her eyes shut. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Enough." Zayan's hand froze midair. His expression darkened. That voice, it wasn't afraid. Slowly he turned his head, his jaw clenching as he looked at the person who had just spoken. And the moment he saw who it was, his entire demeanor shifted. Because this time he wasn't dealing with a helpless maid. This time, it was someone who could destroy him. Zayan Al-Fayed wasn't just rich. He was the kind of rich that made people bow their heads when he walked past. The kind of rich that turned crimes into misunderstandings with a simple phone call. Money wasn't just his weapon, it was his shield. He owned hotels, restaurants, private jets, and an arrogance so thick it suffocated anyone around him. To outsiders, he was a respected businessman, a generous host, a man whose name was always spoken with admiration. But those who worked for him, they knew the truth. Behind the expensive suits and charming smile was a man who demanded perfection. And if you failed him, even for a second, he made sure you never forgot. Tonight was supposed to be one of his grand gatherings. Important guests, business deals disguised as casual conversations. Everything had to be flawless. But now, all anyone could see was the maid on the floor, and the man who had just challenged Zayan in front of everyone. Haidar. Zayan's jaw tightened as he met his gaze. Haidar wasn't a stranger. He had been part of this world for years, moving in the same circles, shaking hands with the same people. He had money, power, but unlike Zayan, he had something more dangerous, a reputation. Haidar wasn't just feared, he was respected. Because unlike Zayan, people didn't obey him out of fear. They obeyed him because they knew. When Haidar spoke, his words carried weight. And right now, in front of everyone, Haidar had done the one thing no one else had dared to do. He had told Zayan to stop. The air was thick with tension. The guests held their breath, waiting for Zayan's response. A slow smirk formed on Zayan's face. He chuckled, a low, mocking sound. Haidar, he said, taking a step closer. I didn't know you were in the business of defending servants now. Haidar's expression didn't change. He didn't blink, he didn't flinch. And I didn't know you were in the business of beating women in front of an audience. His voice was calm, but underneath there was a warning. A ripple went through the crowd. Someone gasped, someone else turned away, pretending they weren't listening. Zayan's fingers twitched. His pride was on the line, his control. If he let this slide, if he backed down now, it wouldn't just be one defiance, it would be the first crack in his empire. And he couldn't afford that. So, he smiled wider. Oh, come on, Haidar. His voice was laced with amusement, but his eyes told a different story. She spilled wine all over my floor. If she can't do her job properly, she should learn to be more careful. Sana was still on the floor, her body stiff, her head down. Haidar took a slow step forward. Or maybe, he said, his tone darkening, you should learn that money doesn't make you untouchable. A flicker of something crossed Zayan's face. Anger? Amusement? It was hard to tell, but whatever it was, it didn't last long. Because before he could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. A voice that made everyone's blood run cold. Someone had just walked in. Someone no one expected. And the moment Zayan saw who it was, his smirk disappeared. For the first time that night, real fear flickered in his eyes. Because this person? They weren't here for small talk. They were here for him. The heavy doors creaked open. The sound alone was enough to make the room shudder. The guests turned their heads, their faces shifting from curiosity to shock. And there, standing at the entrance, was her. Naira. The moment Zayan saw her, his entire body went rigid. The confident smirk he wore just seconds ago was gone. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. His breath caught in his throat. She wasn't supposed to be here. Naira Al-Fayed, his wife. No, his estranged wife. She wasn't the kind of woman who attended these parties anymore, not since she had disappeared from the public eye months ago. Whispers followed her name wherever it was spoken. Rumors of why she had vanished. Some said she had fallen ill. Others claimed she had fled to another country. But the truth? The truth was standing right here, staring straight into Zayan's eyes. The air inside the hall turned suffocating. Naira wasn't just beautiful. She carried an aura that demanded attention. Her cold, unreadable gaze swept over the room, lingering for just a second too long on the trembling maid still kneeling on the floor. Then her eyes locked onto Zayan's. And that was when she said it. A single sentence. A few words that turned the entire night upside down. This has gone on long enough. Zayan exhaled sharply through his nose, his grip tightening around the rim of his glass. He forced a chuckle, but his voice betrayed the tension curling in his chest. I wasn't aware you were invited, dear wife. Naira tilted her head, her lips curving slightly, but there was no amusement in her eyes. I wasn't. A heavy pause. Every guest in the room was now holding their breath. The balance of power had shifted, but no one knew where it would land. Haidar, still standing firm, glanced between them, reading the unspoken war happening in their gazes. Then, Naira turned to Sana, the maid who hadn't moved an inch since the slap. Naira stepped closer, then knelt in front of her. A millionaire's wife, kneeling for a servant. A few people gasped. Some couldn't believe what they were seeing. Are you hurt? Naira's voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp, studying every detail of the bruised face before her. Sana's lips parted, but she only shook her head quickly. Her hands were still trembling. Zayan took a step forward, his patience slipping. That's enough, Naira. His tone was low, threatening. But Naira didn't move. Instead, she gently placed her hand under Sana's chin, lifting her face slightly. A small, almost invisible flicker of rage passed through her eyes. Then she stood up, slowly. And when she faced Zayan again, this time she wasn't just his wife. She was his worst nightmare. I'm taking her with me, she said. A beat of silence. Then, laughter. Low at first, then louder. Zayan was laughing, but not out of amusement. No, this was a warning. A dangerous, unhinged sound. You think you can just walk in here and take my servant? He scoffed, shaking his head. You must have lost your mind. Naira didn't blink. No, Zayan, she said, voice steady. I just stopped being afraid of you. His smile vanished. And for the first time that night, maybe even in his life, Zayan felt something new. Uncertainty. Because if Naira wasn't afraid anymore, then he had something to fear. The silence that followed Naira's words was deafening. Zayan wasn't used to this. He was used to control. He was used to people bending, apologizing, fearing him. But tonight, something was different. His wife, no, the woman who once feared him, was now standing against him. Not in private, Not behind closed doors, but in front of everyone. Zion's fingers twitched. His patience was slipping, his grip on the situation loosening by the second. He had to regain control. Fast. His gaze flickered to the guests. They weren't laughing anymore. Some were whispering, some were just watching, waiting to see what he'd do next. He exhaled sharply, masking his frustration with a smirk. "You must have forgotten your place, wife." He took a slow step forward. "You don't get to make decisions here. Not in my house." "But Naira?" She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just smiled. And that was the moment Zion knew something was wrong. Because that wasn't the smile of a woman who had just made a bold mistake. It was the smile of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Zion narrowed his eyes. "What's this about, Naira?" His voice was lower now, controlled but laced with irritation. "You walk in here after months, act like some kind of savior, and expect me to just hand over my maid? Do you even hear yourself?" Naira tilted her head, as if amused. "Oh, I don't expect anything from you, Zion." Another pause. Another moment where the air turned thick with anticipation. Then, she pulled something from her coat pocket and held it up. A single piece of paper. Zion's heart kicked in his chest before his mind even registered what it was. His smirk wavered. The guests whispered louder now. Some craned their necks to see. And then, in a voice sharp as a knife, Naira spoke. "I own her now." Dead silence. Zion's stomach twisted. "What did you just say?" "I bought her contract," Naira said, voice crisp, clear. "Every maid, every worker under your employment. I own their contracts now." Zion's face drained of color. Impossible. He had a tight grip on everything. His workers, his wealth, his influence. There was no way she could have just taken that from him. Unless a realization hit him like a slap. Haidar. Zion's head snapped toward the man who had been silent all this time, his expression unreadable. It wasn't just Naira. This was planned. Haidar had helped her. Rage boiled in Zion's chest, but before he could lash out, Naira took another step closer. Her voice softened, but it didn't lose its sharpness. "You see, Zion, you've always believed money is power, and for years you used it to control everything around you." She held up the contract between two fingers. "Well, I just used your own game against you." A slow, sinking feeling crawled through Zion's body. This wasn't just about a maid. This was about his power, his control. And tonight, in front of everyone, he was losing it. For the first time in years, Zion didn't know what to say. But Naira wasn't done. She stepped aside, turning to Sana, the woman who had been nothing but a shadow in his house. The woman he had just struck like she was nothing. Now she wasn't just a maid. Now she was free. Naira extended her hand toward Sana. "You don't have to stay here anymore," she said. "You're coming with me." Sana looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to leave, but because she had never been offered a way out before. And then, she took Naira's hand. The moment their fingers met, a shift happened in the room. Zion saw it. He felt it. The moment Sana stood up and stepped away from him, it wasn't just a servant leaving her master. It was proof. Proof that his control was slipping. Proof that even he could be challenged. And that was unacceptable. Zion's chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. His fists clenched. His mind was already working, already calculating. This wasn't over. Not even close. Then, just as Naira and Sana turned toward the exit, Zion's voice rang out, low, cold, and carrying a weight that made the room shudder. "You think this is the end?" Naira paused, but she didn't turn around. Zion's lips curled into something dark, something dangerous. "You just started a war, wife." For the first time that night, Haidar finally spoke again. His voice was calm but firm. "No, Zion," he said. "You did that a long time ago." And with that, Naira, Sana, and Haidar walked out. leaving Zion standing there, surrounded by his wealth, his power, and something new. A loss he never saw coming. But if they thought he would let this go, they had no idea what was coming next. For the next few days, the city buzzed with whispers. No one had ever challenged Zion al-Mansur before. Not like this. A millionaire humiliated in his own mansion. His wife walking out with one of his servants. The power shift was undeniable. And yet, Naira knew better than to celebrate too soon. Because Zion wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was the kind of man who made sure that if he lost, everyone else lost with him. The storm was coming. She just didn't know how soon. Late one night as she sat in her quiet villa, a sharp knock echoed through the halls. Haidar looked up from his seat across from her. He knew it too. This wasn't a normal knock. Naira exhaled slowly. It's him. She stood adjusting the sleeves of her silk robe before walking toward the door. She didn't hesitate. She pulled it open. And there he was, Zion. His presence filled the doorway like a shadow stretching in the dark. But there was something different about him tonight. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suits, his gold watch flashing under the chandeliers. No, tonight he looked calm. And that was more terrifying than seeing him furious. Because when Zion was calm, it meant he was already 10 steps ahead. Naira crossed her arms. What do you want? Zion smiled, a slow, calculated smile. To talk, he said smoothly. Nothing more. She didn't believe that for a second, but she stepped aside anyway. Because she knew one thing. When you show fear to a predator, they attack. And she refused to be prey. The moment he stepped inside, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Haidar stayed standing, his eyes locked on Zion like a guard dog ready to pounce. Zion, however, ignored him completely. His focus was only on Naira. He walked over to the large window, looking out at the glittering city below. You've done well for yourself, he mused. A woman who once lived in my shadow, now standing on her own. Naira said nothing. Zion finally turned to face her. But tell me, Naira, he said, voice smooth but laced with something dangerous. Do you really think this is over? Naira's jaw clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. Zion took slow, deliberate steps toward her. You embarrassed me, he continued, in front of my guests, my associates, people who respect me. He was closer now, his voice a whisper. You stole from me. Naira held her ground. I took back what was never yours to begin with. Zion chuckled, a dark, amused sound. Is that what you tell yourself? He tilted his head. That you're some kind of hero? Then without warning, he reached into his pocket. Haidar's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his side, ready. But what Zion pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a phone. He held it up, tapped the screen once, and then a video started playing. Naira's breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold. Because on that screen was Sana *, bound to a chair, a cloth stuffed in her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. And standing behind her? Zion's men. Naira's heart pounded against her ribs. Zion smiled. You took something from me. He turned the phone around, staring at the video like it was a masterpiece. So I took something from you. Naira's fist clenched. Haidar was already reaching for his own phone, ready to make a call. But Zion shook his head. I wouldn't do that if I were you. He tapped the screen again, zooming in on Sana's terrified face. You see, I have very impatient men. He looked up, locking eyes with Naira. So here's the deal, wife. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You come back to me. Another pause. Or she doesn't make it through the night. Silence. A silence so thick, so suffocating, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Zion leaned in, just enough for his breath to brush against her ear. Make your choice. Then with one final smirk, he turned and walked out, leaving Naira standing there. Heart racing, mind spinning, because now the game had changed. And the next move would determine everything. The moment the door shut behind Zion, Naira felt the weight of the world crush down on her chest. Sana. She had fought so hard to get here, to break free, to win. But now Zion had flipped the entire game in one move. She turned to Hyder. "We have to move fast." His jaw was tight, his fists clenched. "I'll get my men. We'll find her before he does something stupid." Naira's pulse was hammering. She had to stay calm. Think. Zion was unpredictable, but one thing was certain: he wanted her to panic. And she refused to play into his hands. "No," she said. "We're not running in blind. That's what he expects." Haidar exhaled sharply. "Then what's the plan?" She grabbed her phone, dialed a number. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Amir." Haidar's eyes widened slightly. "You're calling him?" Naira ignored him. "I need your help." A pause, then a low chuckle on the other end. "Well, well," Amir said. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again." "No time for games," she snapped. "Zion has Sana." The amusement in Amir's voice vanished. "Where?" Naira glanced at Haidar. "We don't know. Not yet." "Then you'd better start figuring it out," Amir said, his voice turning cold. "Because if Zion's desperate enough to use her as bait, he won't hesitate to kill her." A chill ran down Naira's spine. She knew that. She hated that she knew that. Haidar was already moving, pulling out his own phone, calling in his people. They had to act fast, because every second that passed was another second closer to disaster. Asterisk. Meanwhile, asterisk. Sana sat in a dark, damp warehouse. Her wrists burned from the tight ropes digging into her skin. Her heartbeat was a drum in her ears. She had no idea how long she'd been here. Minutes? Hours? Time felt like an illusion. The men standing guard barely looked at her. To them, she was just a bargaining chip. But that meant one thing: she was still alive, which meant there was still a chance. Slowly, quietly, she started working at the ropes. Her fingers were numb, shaking. But she didn't stop. Didn't even blink. Because she had made a promise to herself. She would make it out of here, no matter what it took. Back at the villa, Amir walked in like he owned the place, his dark eyes scanning the room. "You look terrible," he told Naira. "Not in the mood," she snapped. Amir smirked. "Fine, let's talk strategy." He turned to Haidar. "We have one advantage right now." Haidar crossed his arms. "And that is?" Amir leaned against the table. "Zion thinks we're desperate." He let the words sink in before continuing. "So let's use that." Naira's brows furrowed. "You mean?" Amir nodded. "We give him what he wants." Silence. Then Haidar scoffed. "That's insane. You want Naira to walk back to him?" Amir shrugged. "Not permanently." Naira swallowed hard. She hated the idea. But deep down, she knew Amir was right. This was the only way to get close enough to Zion. To get to Sana. To end this. She exhaled more and "I'll do it." Haidar tensed. "Naira, I have to." She turned to Amir. "What's the plan?" Amir's smile was sharp. "Simple. You walk through that door." He met her gaze. "And we burn his empire to the ground." The black car pulled up to Zion's mansion. Naira stepped out, her heartbeat steady, her face unreadable. She was walking straight into the fire. And she knew it. But she had no choice. Behind her, Amir and Haidar were waiting, hidden, watching. If everything went according to plan, they'd have seconds to act. If it didn't, she'd be on her own. She walked through the grand entrance, her heels clicking against the marble floor. And there he was, Zion, standing at the top of the staircase, arms crossed, eyes filled with victory. "You actually came," he mused, descending the steps. "I almost thought you'd run." Naira lifted her chin. "Where is she?" Zion smiled. "Oh, Sana?" He gestured to one of his guards. The man disappeared into a hallway, then returned, dragging Sana with him. Her wrists were still bound, her face pale, but her eyes lit up when she saw Naira. Relief, hope. Zion tilted his head. You kept your part of the deal. Now, let's talk about mine. Naira's hands clenched. Let her go. Zion let out a low chuckle. And why would I do that? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think I don't know you have people outside? That Haidar and Amir are just waiting for me to make a mistake? Naira's pulse pounded. Zion smirked. If I let her go, what guarantee do I have that you'll stay? And then, without warning, he pulled a gun. Aimed it straight at Sana's head. The world seemed to stop. Naira's breath caught in her throat. Sana gasped, frozen in terror. And Zion? He laughed. You should see your face. His finger hovered over the trigger. So tell me, Naira, are you ready to do exactly as I say? The silence stretched. Then bang! A gunshot exploded through the air. Zion staggered back. His grip on the gun loosened. Sana ducked just as Haidar came crashing through the entrance. Gun raised. Chaos erupted. Guards drew their weapons, shots fired in every direction. Amir took down 2 men in seconds, moving with sharp precision. Naira lunged forward, yanking Sana away from Zion's grasp. Run! She shouted. Sana bolted toward the exit as Amir covered her, his gun taking out another guard. But Zion wasn't going down without a fight. He recovered fast, grabbing a knife from the table. And then he came straight for Naira. She barely dodged in time, his blade slicing through the air just inches from her. Haidar lunged, grabbing Zion by the collar, shoving him hard against the marble wall. You lost, Haidar growled. Zion spat out blood, laughing. You think? He coughed. You think this ends with me? Haidar didn't hesitate. One final punch, and Zion collapsed. Breathing, but finished. Sirens blared in the distance. The police. It was over. Naira exhaled, her hands trembling as she turned to Sana. She was free. Finally, free. But deep inside, Naira knew. This wasn't just about Zion. This was about every man like him. And she was just getting started. The police swarmed the mansion, their flashing lights casting long shadows over the blood-stained floor. Zion, half conscious, was dragged to his feet by 2 officers. His face was bruised, his expensive suit torn, but his smirk, that hadn't faded. As he was shoved toward the police car, he turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Naira. Enjoy this while it lasts, he muttered. You think you've won? Naira didn't flinch. She stepped forward, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. I didn't just win, she said coldly. I ended you. Zion's smirk twitched, just for a second. And then he was gone, swallowed by the night as the car doors slammed shut behind him. Silence settled. Sana let out a shuddering breath, gripping Naira's hand tightly. It's over, she whispered. But Naira wasn't so sure. Because men like Zion, they weren't just one person. They were everywhere. She turned to Amir and Haidar, both standing beside her, watching the police handle the scene. Amir gave her a small nod. You did good. Naira scoffed. Don't act so surprised, Haidar chuckled. We should go before someone asks too many questions. Naira glanced at the house one last time, the place where everything started, where she almost lost herself. And now it was nothing more than a ruin of a man's ego. She exhaled. Let's go. As they walked away, Sana squeezed her hand. What happens now? Naira glanced at her. A million thoughts raced through her mind. She could go back to her life, pretend this was just one chapter, one nightmare she had barely survived. Or she could make sure this never happened to anyone else. She looked at Haidar, at Amir. They were waiting for her answer. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. We start something new. And as the car drove off into the night, Naira knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning